As dawn broke on a new, modern age in America at the turn of the 20th century, the thrilling sport of motorcycle racing captivated the nation. The sport, much like the machines themselves, debuted at a pace unlike anything seen before or since. Within the first 5 years of their arrival, motorcycles were being produced by multiple dozens of companies, many with roots in the novelty of the previous era, the bicycle. Former cycling stars, the sporting icons of the day, began shifting their focus to the increasingly lucrative motorcycle racing game, and national press was swelling with articles about new machines and the men who raced them. Naturally, the burgeoning motorcycle manufacturers looked to capture the attention of the public, and one guaranteed venue in which to do so was on the racetrack. A new industry was born. Sanctioning bodies, such as the Federation of American Motorcyclists, or FAM, regulated the rapidly evolving sport. What began with gentlemanly wagers at local horse tracks or sprints up the steepest road in town scaled quickly to national events, sponsored professionals, factory teams, and grudge matches running at breakneck speeds around purpose-built venues. Jack Prince's spectacular wooden stadiums, known as motordromes, were conceived and constructed nationwide amid the public's increasing demand for more. Motorcycle companies quickly began adapting their road models to be competitive, or in some instances, developed factory works racers specifically for the new bore track stadiums. It was in that moment that motorcycles changed, evolving into purebred racers capable of blistering levels of speed for the era. Among these early specials was perhaps the most coveted mythical racing motorcycles of all time, the Indian Big Base 8-valve. Motorcycling's pioneers like Charles Gustafson at Reading Standard, William Ottaway at Thor, and Joseph Merkel of his own brand were keen to push the envelope, developing racers in an attempt to capture the attention that came with victory. Still, no one was further forward in the lead than Indian's Oscar Hedstrom. A former cycling champion and savvy engineer, Hedstrom co-founded Indian Motorcycles with fellow cycling trailblazer George Hindy in 1901 as an offshoot of their successful experiments with motor pacing machines for the cycle racing circuit. As a company, Indian was born on the track, and with the curious genius of Hedstrom in the workshop, the brand proved to be a force as soon as it entered the motorcycle game. Hedstrom consistently drove Indian's success through a series of racing prototypes while simultaneously hiring the best, most daring pioneer racers to jockey them, men like Fred Height, Paul Durkham, Charlie Balk, Ray Seymour, and Jacob DeRozier. In fact, many of the Springfield Company's innovative road models were derived from Hedstrom's numerous prototype racing machines, the first of which dated back to 1903. After modifying his first motorized tandem pacing machine, dubbed the Typhoon, to be a single-seat land speed bike for the Carnival of Speed in Ormond Beach, Florida, 1903, Hedstrom became among the first men in America to set land speed records. Prodded along by his failure to keep up with fellow New England engineer and motor pioneer Glenn Curtis with his Hercules V-twin the next year, Hedstrom developed Indian's first V-twin later in 1904. What followed was the development of several one-off prototypes, experimenting with geometry, displacement, even reworking massive experimental French-made engines for machines like his unique Hotshot, despite it being too large for sanctioned competition at the time. So, as race promoter Jack Prince began erecting his first bore-track motordromes, Hindy and Hedstrom made sure that it was their marquee that filled the headlines with win after win. Noting the opportunity at hand, George Hindy went so far as to secure a plot of land in Springfield, known as the Orchard, for Prince to build his second bore-track motordrome and the first with a circular design in 1910 so that Indian could have the advantage of a testing facility near the factory. The saucer tracks demanded machines that were purebreds in nature, no frills or comforts, just unencumbered speed machines. Despite being unnecessary weight, brakes and multi-speed transmissions were also a novelty in production motorcycles at the time, and such features were readily sacrificed on the first racing motorcycles. Suspension was also deemed a hindrance on the boards given that the goal was to run wide open on the banked wooden walls. Riding positions were lowered, bars cut short and turned down, frames shortened, and engines dropped to lower the center of gravity. Some machines went so far as to do away with throttle linkages and ignition controls, opting instead for a kill switch installed on the bars. The riders would get a bump start and run wide open around the tracks before killing the ignition and coasting back to the pits, and they would do so in little more than wool sweaters and leather caps for protection. To be a board track racer was to be among the toughest men on earth. It was in May 1911 that one of Hedstrom's most celebrated and successful racing prototypes made its debut. Indian's valve and head special, commonly known now as the 8-valve, was first tested not on the boards of the motordrome, but on the dirt tracks of the Northeastern Circuit. On May 5th at the Bennings dirt track just outside Washington, D.C., newcomer Frank Hart made his debut with Indian on board Oscar Hedstrom's latest design. Known as the Wall Street Comet, Hart was a stockbroker by day, racing in amateur events for the Reading Standard Company on the weekends. His skill in the saddle drew the attention of Hedstrom, who was headhunting new talent for his East Coast stable of riders, and tapped the young Hart to test out his latest experimental racer at the low-stakes event in Bennings. The new 6-horsepower overhead valve Indian, dubbed number 26, featured 2 exhaust and 2 intake valves per cylinder, each pair being actuated by a rocker arm and positioned over the combustion chamber of the cylinders. The concept of overhead valves traces its roots to experiments as early as 1898 in internal combustion engines, but it wasn't until Buick unveiled its Model B in 1904 did the configuration prove commercially viable. Hedstrom's new 8-valve would break the mold by bringing the overhead valve arrangement to motorcycles in America, but he wasn't the first to have the thought. Former Harley-Davidson engineer Perry E. Mack was the first to unveil an overhead valve motorcycle engine during his time working at the Waverly Manufacturing Company, which was sold initially as an engine only and later as a complete motorcycle when the company reorganized into the Jefferson Marquis. Mack's overhead valve V-twin was released in 1910, 1 year before Hedstrom's design debuted, but Jefferson lacked the resources to produce the machine at scale. However, like Buick, Hedstrom had all the manufacturing might and deep pockets of Indian to invest in the overhead valve platform. Using his proven F-head factory racing motorcycle as a base, Hedstrom's first 8-valve prototype, designated number 26, incorporated his new top-end design with only minor tweaks to the rest of the bike. An elongated oil tank positioned on the seat tube featured a right-side cutaway for the rear cylinder exhaust. Another modification was the ported cylinders, featuring a series of small machined holes underneath the lower fin to aid in airflow and boost power. The bottom end was of standard production size and a primary drive was fitted. Hedstrom kept the factory racing chassis largely unchanged as a short-coupled, rigid, loop-frame design. So, for the low-stakes races at the Bennings track, Frank Hart made his Indian debut along with the new number 26 machine on May 5, 1911. Putting on a tremendous show and winning the 5- and 10-mile amateur races. The following week, Hedstrom invited more of the brass at Indian to come down, as well as several of the team's West Coast talent to check out the new machine and his newest rider. Again, Hart and his lucky number 26 8-valve proved to be the ones to beat, only losing heats when the powerful new machine threw a tire. Over the coming weeks, Hart and another new Indian rider named Fred Mercier tested and tuned the experimental 8-valve in regional events while Indian's old guard, like Charlie Balk and John Constant, dominated the professional classes on their proven F-head machines. Surprisingly, Indian star rider Jacob DeRozier wasn't racing during this pivotal moment as he prepared for his historic trip to the Isle of Man. A few weeks after their debut, Hart and the 8-valve took the 10-mile open at the big races in Gutenberg, New Jersey on May 21st. Indian star rider Charlie Balk won the 5-mile professional event, and the two men split the honors for the half-hour mixed, with Hart taking the amateur title and Balk the professional. Hart then boarded a train to Chicago to run at the FAM's National Championship races held at the Hawthorne Dirt Track, where, again, Frank Hart and his trusty Indian 8-valve were only ever beaten by bad luck with tires, though he did secure the 5-mile amateur national title. Hart established himself as a quickly rising star on the national circuit, and with the 8-valve, Hedstrom had demonstrated yet again that if you wanted to win in professional motorcycle racing in America, you had to get past him first. But a new contender, Excelsior, soon emerged on the new board track in Chicago that would send Oscar Hedstrom back to the drawing board once again. Created in part with the expertise of Excelsior star rider Farmer Joe Walters, a powerful new racing motorcycle, succinctly designated the 7 and built especially for the increasingly popular board track motordromes, quickly proved a threat to the perennially dominant Indian at the races. A seasoned racing pioneer of the Denver circuit, Walters first acquired an Excelsior mount in 1910 from the local Denver dealer, and when he discovered that the belt on his ported Excelsior single would slip once it became oily, he set about converting it to a chain drive, as such introducing the first chain-driven Excelsior, squeezing 10 miles per hour more out of the machine. Still, It was in 1911, once bicycle magnate Ignace Schwinn acquired the Excelsior Marquis, that the factory racing program was given the support and resources it needed to challenge Indian on the track, and Walters was recruited to spearhead the campaign. He went to work in Chicago with Excelsior's engineers to produce a thoroughbred racer, and with the 7, Walters and Excelsior would alter the course of American motorcycle racing history. The 61 cubic inch V-twin competition special produced 7 horsepower, with its lightened and ported cylinders combined with a short-coupled racing frame, an extended and braced steering head, dropped handlebars, a rigid fork, and a Hertz magneto. Walters debuted the new machine on August 5, 1911, and quickly established that he would be the man to beat in the newly constructed 1/3 of a mile motordrome at Riverview, Jack Prince's 8th such track. By the end of the month, Walters had set new records from 1 to 10 miles, hitting speeds of 87 miles per hour on board his new 7 and knocking iconic names like Balk, Chappell, Mitchell, and Graves off the record sheets. On August 26th, Walters trimmed 1/5 of a second off the mighty Jake DeRozier's 1-mile record, which he had just set at the Brooklands track in England while in the UK for the Isle of Man TT a few months prior. DeRozier, having only recently returned, was in Chicago to witness the carnage, looking on as the slight man they called Farmer Joe blasted past his hard-fought records at 90 miles per hour, all while on a machine without his beloved Indian script across the tank. With Walters in the saddle, the Excelsior 7 racked up the victories, stealing record after record from Indian with its prowess on the timbers of America's motordromes. Hedstrom took note and returned to his machine shop determined to build a contender using his 8-valve platform as a base. It was only back in May 1911 that he unveiled his first 8-valve, but by that November, a new breed of 8-valve, specifically engineered to lay waste to any who challenged, debuted on a new saucer in Oakland, California. Hedstrom's new 8-valve design distilled a board track racing machine to its essence, raw and uncompromising speed. Videos like this one, and the hundreds of historic articles available at archivemoto.com, are made possible by the supporters on Patreon. Thank you for making this project possible. If you would like to join them in helping keep this history alive, follow the link in the description. Your support is sincerely appreciated. Taking cues from the success of the Excelsior's design while incorporating the strengths from his earlier 8-valve, the new machine's rigid frame was made slightly taller and longer. The engine loop was set lower and the steering tube elongated and raked slightly forward. The fuel tank was redesigned to fit the new chassis, giving the new 8-valve its distinctive, elongated line at the neck, sharply sloping in the rear to keep the riding position as low as possible. The oil tank was notched on the right side to accommodate the short exhaust from the rear cylinder and aid in warming the oil. The traditional jackshaft assembly was deleted altogether as the machine was now a direct drive, the chain coming directly off the crank, and a rigid set of foot pegs were attached given its lack of pedals. Again, inspired by the Excelsior, Hedstrom increased the size of the flywheels and cases, which were reinforced giving their larger size with distinctive cast webbing. Being purpose-built for the motordrome, the big base had no brakes, transmission, clutch, suspension, or throttle. Power regulation is left to a metal tab on the handlebars, which would break the electrical circuit from the magneto. The cylinder heads were ported, and each head had 2 intake and 2 exhaust valves actuated in pairs by a rocker arm, so gases could more efficiently move in and out of the chamber. As often was the case with Hedstrom's designs, the machine's simplicity was elegant, raw, and efficient, and its power would soon redefine the idea of speed. With its distinct augmentations, Hedstrom's new board track racer would come to be known as the Big Base 8-valve, a legendary machine which today remains among the most coveted motorcycles in history. However, not all was well in the Indian camp, and despite Oscar Hedstrom having just developed such a legendary racing machine, the company's 2 best riders were no longer a part of the factory team. The story goes that after witnessing the prowess of Joe Walters and the Excelsior 7, Indian star rider Jacob DeRozier wrote a biting letter to Indian Hedstrom as his F-head number 21 machine and the number 23 of his teammate Charlie Balk were simply not up to the task of keeping pace with the Excelsior. Perhaps a bit soured from his lackluster performance at the Isle of Man TT and unsatisfied with the level of Balk's performance against Walters in Chicago, DeRozier wrote Hedstrom, "Either build new machines or wipe that word speed off your advertisements," signing the wire with both his and Balk's name. With DeRozier's infamous salty temperament surely a factor, he received notice back from Springfield that "your services are severed for all time." Balk received a similar letter stating, "As we have no machines at the present time fast enough for you to win on, we will have to lay you off until we build faster machines. In the meantime, you will have to do the best you can. Your paychecks will continue for 2 weeks. Signed, Oscar Hedstrom." The move came as a shock to DeRozier, as he had begun his relationship with Indian almost as soon as the company had been formed back in 1901, and as such had become America's first racing star with the brand. Possibly even more shocked, however, was Charlie Balk, who it has been reported had no knowledge of his inclusion in DeRozier's letter to Springfield, and now was without a mount as a result. Nevertheless, Excelsior, now under the ownership of the ambitious Ignace Schwinn, was poised to expand their racing program given the runaway success of Walters and the new 7. Excelsior immediately offered a contract to both men, providing them with their own competition Special 7s to finish out the 1911 season. Ironically, the demands DeRozier had made in his snappy letter to Hindi and Hedstrom were features found throughout the new big base in development at the same time. But with Charlie Balk and Jake DeRozier gone, Hedstrom tapped veteran racer Ray Seymour to unveil the new big base 8-valve at the Elmhurst Motordrome as soon as it was ready. On November 19, 1911, Seymour unleashed the new big base on the boards in Oakland, quickly demonstrating its potential by taking the lead at nearly 90 miles per hour. However, in typical fashion given the dreadful state of tire technology at the time, Seymour's rear tire blew apart at speed. The seasoned rider maintained control, but as he descended the track, another rider, Theo Samuelson, slammed into the limping racer, sending them both violently tumbling at speed across the splinter field. It wasn't the debut that any within the Indian camp had hoped for, but after a short recovery, a bruised and battered Seymour returned with his repaired big base 2 weeks later, ready to let loose once again on the banked boards in Elmhurst. He promptly set a new track record at 88.5 miles per hour before facing off against Walters with enough power to best the current champion. Still, Walters was a highly skilled competitor, and the two battled elbow to elbow during the first 10-mile race. Seymour continued testing his new mount with a few hiccups along the way, mostly stuck valves and blown tires, but Hedstrom's new Purebred had answered the threat posed by Walters and the Excelsior, and the coming season would be one of the most thrilling in the sport. Though word was spreading through the ranks of the West Coast racing circuit, the first press on Indian's big base 8-valve only began trickling out that December, with blurbs describing it as the direct drive special. On December 30th, another article was published announcing that the talented young professional Eddie Hasha, known as the Texas Cyclone, had been recruited by Hedstrom to take delivery of his own big base 8-valve in San Francisco and join up with Seymour. On January 6, 1912, an article in Bicycling World and Motorcycle Review introduced enthusiasts to Hedstrom's latest factory racer, with an image and a detailed description of its refinements over Hedstrom's first valve-in-head machines. The pair continued racing, testing, and tuning their two big bases until February 1912. Then Hasha and Seymour uncrated them in Los Angeles for the opening of Jack Prince's latest motordrome, the steep 50-degree banked boards of the LA Stadium. On February 12, 1912, Hasha, who was making his debut in Los Angeles, leveled the field of Class A competitors on board his new big base labeled number 32 in front of an opening crowd of 8,000. Hasha not only won each event in distances of 2, 3, and 4 miles, beating out Excelsior's powerhouse team of Walters, DeRozier, and Balk, but in each distance he ran, he reclaimed the standing record by wide margins. Within 2 weeks, Hasha and Seymour had amassed all of the records only recently lost to Excelsior with their pair of big base machines. Then, on April 7th, at the Big Wooden Mile at Playa del Rey, Hasha smashed the record marks from 1 to 10 miles, hitting a new top speed of 95 miles per hour and further cementing himself and the Indian Big Base 8-valve as an unbeatable pair. Seymour and Hasha continued on their warpath in the early 1912 season on board the only two Big Base 8-valves to have rolled out of Springfield at that point. Ray Seymour again upped the top mark at Playa in May by setting a new record speed of 97.83 miles per hour, affectionately nicknaming his big base Big Buck. Then, in July, the world's best motorcycle racers descended on Columbus, Ohio for the opening races at the country's latest motordrome. Race promoter and track builder Jack Prince upped the scale of the new track, increasing its length to a half mile around and a continuous banking of 48 degrees. The opening events were scheduled as the first Federation of American Motorcyclists National Championship races, drawing the biggest names in the country and the absolute best the manufacturers had to offer. However, Due to conflicts between management at Excelsior and officials in the FAM, the Chicago-based marquee refused to participate in the races in Columbus, leaving the door wide open for Indian to sweep the titles. Oscar Hedstrom arrived in force with a second pair of big base machines to compete alongside Seymour and Hasha. Morty Graves, another seasoned pioneer racer from the early days of LA's Agriculture Park, was tapped to jockey one of the new big bases, the other being staged in the pits as a reserve. Despite having been fired with DeRozier the season prior, Charlie Balk remained one of the best riders in the sport. He was the star at Excelsior, yet he arrived eager to talk his way into a ride on the new big base. After a bit of coaxing, Hedstrom decided to grant Balk's wish, giving his old champion a chance to run in the time trial event on board the reserve big base. Without a single practice lap on the new machine, Charlie Fearless Balk shot around the half-mile saucer in Columbus, coming within a fraction of a second of Eddie Hasha, hitting a top speed of 94 miles per hour and securing his old spot on the Springfield factory team once again. Indian's Johnny U. Constant took the national amateur title on board a modified production F-head racer, while Ray Seymour decimated the competition, winning every race and becoming America's first national champion on board his big base 8-valve. The machine was undeniable, securing Indian's claim to every standing record at any distance or speed, including all national titles for both professional and amateur classes. The big base was Hedstrom's swan song at Indian, a fiery purebred birthed at the peak of the motordrome craze in America, which put Indian back on top. Still, just as soon as the big base 8-valve, the quintessential board track racing machine, arrived on the timber saucers, the sport itself was already in jeopardy. In just the first half of 1912 alone, 10 riders died racing in motordromes across the country. Even America's first motorcycle racing star, Jake DeRozier, was in dire straits following his collision racing with Balk in March at the LA Stadium, in which he sustained serious injuries, ones that would ultimately lead to his death in 1913. Public interest was already in a state of decline given the rising death toll when, in September, the tragedy that unfolded at the Vailsburg Motordrome would rattle the country to its core. While racing his big base at 92 miles per hour, Eddie Hasha lost control, sending the young star and his machine careening into the stands. Hasha was killed instantly, along with 6 spectators, the youngest being a 14-year-old boy. Hasha's mangled big base then fell back to the track, colliding with his teammate Johnny Albright, who was violently thrown from his mount, adding one more death to the toll that day. It was the gruesome accident at Vailsburg that sent shockwaves through the country, producing the now infamous Murderdrome moniker, and marked the beginning of the end for the perilous sport. In the aftermath, Hasha's mighty big base 8-valve was left in a twisted pile, as was Albright's F-head racer. Devastated, Hedstrom recalled his fleet of big base 8-valves to the factory in Springfield. Reigning national champion Ray Seymour, who had previously refused to marry given the inherent risk of motorcycle racing, promptly resigned, along with several other veteran racers who all walked away from the sport altogether. Charlie Balk all but quit himself, stepping away for months before returning to win the inaugural Eglin Road race in July the following year. 1913 would mark the beginning of the industry transitioning away from the sensational motordromes that had been so popular, as manufacturers, racers, and the FAM began favoring flat tracks and the emerging European Grand Prix style races. For Indian's big base 8-valve, the trauma of Hasha's crash, along with the evolving preference in racing venues, marked the end for the iconic machine, for what is the greatest board track racing motorcycle ever produced without a board track on which to race it? There would be but only a few occasions that one of Hedstrom's unbridled big base 8-valves made an appearance after 1912, with riders like Morty Graves and Harry Glenn jockeying one on the boards in Atlanta at Jack Prince's Southern Dixie Circuit at the twilight of the Motordrome era in 1913 and 14, but then they all but vanished. However, Hedstrom's initial 8-valve design, like the more tame prototype ridden by Frank Hart and Fred Mercier in the spring of 1911, struck the right balance between capability and control. Indian's standard 8-valve became a staple factory competition platform for the brand throughout the teens and into the 1920s, in Grand Prix, Speedway, and dirt track races, answered only by the emerging Harley-Davidson factory program under the direction of William Ottaway following World War I. Yet, despite its short lifespan and uncompromising nature, the Big Bass 8-valve remains one of the most coveted motorcycles ever manufactured. Much like the fabled board-track motordromes on which they raced, just as quickly as the Big Bass 8-valve arrived, Indian's legendary Thoroughbred, the motorcycle which regained the Springfield brand its position at the top of the sport, the culmination of Oscar Hedstrom's dedication to building the fastest two-wheeled machines, they were gone. After a century of rumors, curious study, and decades of hunting, enthusiasts have only been able to uncover a couple of examples of the elusive Big Bass, or piece them together and remake the iconic board-track racer from the little that remains. Indian's Big Bass 8-valve was the very concept of speed, raw and uncompromising, distilled by one of the most talented engineering pioneers specifically for the task of speed. It was unbeatable, and refined in its simplicity as only Oscar Hedstrom could accomplish. And for that, Indian's Big Bass 8-valve remains a legendary machine, equal parts brutality and elegance, the embodiment of the thrilling age of the board-track motordrome, and in a word, a purebred.